welcome to this Religious Ethics Walking Talking Mark. I'm Ben Wardle and we're going to be exploring some of the key questions in religious ethics in the style of 30 mark answers. Now this is designed for the new OCR Religious Ethics examination. But it's applicable to all courses. We're looking at the key topics that will come up in religious ethics. So let me just talk you through the questions. They are available down below, so do make sure you get a copy of the questions and you're ready for all that note taking. The questions are: natural law situationalism means that it does not offer precise answers to difficult dilemmas. To what extent is Kant's ethical teaching helpful in resolving all ethical problems? Situation ethics is neither Christian nor believable. Discuss. To what extent is utilitarianism helpful in living a truly moral life? And situationalism is the best method for assessing whether euthanasia is morally acceptable. For all these questions, we'll start by examining your knowledge and understanding of the key concepts behind the ethical theory, and then looking at applying it to the statement given, applying it to real life, looking at those key evaluation points on those strengths and those weaknesses. So we're going to start with the first question on natural law, asking whether situationalism means that it does not offer precise answers to difficult dilemmas. Now this is a hard question, but it's all about taking your key knowledge of natural law and then applying it and incorporating into that your evaluation points. So what is natural law? To start, we need to trace it right back to ancient Greek philosophy, because Aristotle was the first pioneer, if you like, of natural law. And he said that goodness is something fulfilling its nature. So for something to be good, it's fulfilling its nature. And there, in those words, he cemented in human history this connection between what is natural and what is good. So the idea that what's natural is what is good. And he said that natural law, so he spoke himself on natural law, he said natural law is right reason in accordance with nature. And here again he encapsulates a key principle of natural law, that it is the use of reasoning, so the use of your thinking and your rational thoughts and reflection to interpret the natural world, to interpret nature in order to come to the right conclusions. The idea that we use our reasoning to interpret nature to know what is good. And this cements in the minds of this philosophy that what is natural is good, and that we can know that through our use of reasoning and interpreting the world around us. So the key components that Aristotle introduced to natural law are that what's natural is good, because goodness is something fulfilling its nature, that we use reason to interpret the natural world and so to know what is good. And then this idea of telos, because Aristotle was crazy about telos. He thought everything has a purpose to fulfill. You'll know from philosophy that Aristotle believed in two states of potentiality and actuality. And the whole point and the whole reason for all movement and existence is to fulfill its purpose. So everything needs to fulfill its purpose. And for him, goodness is something fulfilling its nature. So to do what is natural is to fulfill that purpose. And he believed that everything from the universe to an individual human being has that telos. And by fulfilling that telos, that purpose, you're doing what is natural to you. You're achieving what's highest in your nature. And for human beings, this was eudaimonia, the idea that you should fulfill what is the highest in your nature, so fulfill your potential in order to achieve happiness. So several years later, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the key doctors of the Catholic Church, came along and he thought, you know what, I really love this idea from Aristotle of a natural law, that what should be done, that the right thing to do is discoverable in nature. So he said, you know what, I like this idea, I'm going to pinch it and I'm going to pioneer it and I'm going to incorporate God into it. And so St. Thomas Aquinas said that natural law is the sharing in the divine eternal law by rational creatures. And what Aquinas is saying here is that nature is a manifestation of God, that through nature human beings can know God. As a key Catholic thinker, you'll know that St. Thomas Aquinas is very passionate about an idea of a creator God. He's got a teleological argument, that arrow and the archer, that there's an intelligent being directing creatures towards their end. And so for the human being, gifted with the gift of reason, with conscious thought, with that ability to reflect and to think things through rationally, he believes God has given human beings reason to then interpret the natural world and to through that know what is the right thing to do. And St. Thomas Aquinas proposed that there are 4 key levels of the law. It starts at the very top with eternal law, and it is a triangle shape, so at the top we've got eternal law, and this is the idea that God represents at the very, very top an eternal law. So it is his law, his purpose, his intention for the universe, and this isn't known to man. Only God knows this. It is God, it is eternal, it's unchanging, and it's at the very top. Below that we have the divine law, and that is the revelation of the eternal law, so the revelation of God's commands, his beliefs, his purpose, intentions in religious scripture. So for example, the Bible would be seen as an example of divine law because it reveals the 10 Commandments, for example. So it is a revelation of the eternal law. So that's the divine law, the religious revelation, if you like. Below that, we then have the natural law, and that is the natural world around us. And Aquinas thought that the eternal law is manifested in the natural world. So you can see what is natural, what is in God's plan, his purpose, through nature. So for example, reproduction in animal species, he'd say that shows us that that's part of God's eternal law. That's what he wants us to do because it's in nature. We can see it in nature. That is the purpose of existence, because nature reveals the divine, the eternal law. And then at the very bottom of that triangle, we've got human law, and they're the human laws, says it on the tin, they're the laws that men make. So for example, we look at the natural world and we see that to murder or killing is a bad thing. It harms nature, it harms creation. So we then know, right, well that's probably because the eternal law is against murder. The divine law says do not kill, so we create human laws. So it's illegal to murder, for example. So the human law is based on an interpretation of the natural law, and it's also inspired by the divine law to create rules in society. So whereas the eternal law is a very abstract concept beyond human beings, we can't access it, at the other end of that scale, human law is created by humans and it's all about societies, whereas the eternal law is of course about the whole universe. So we've got a real spectrum there, from that massive eternal law which isn't known to man to the human laws actually made by man based on that interpretation of nature. Now we have that manifestation in nature of the eternal law, but as we've said, there is that need for reasoning, because Aquinas did not believe God hands you all the answers on a plate. Instead, the individual has to use their reasoning, their God-given reasoning, to interpret the world around them and to know what is natural, what is right. And so the individual within natural law has got responsibility. It is their job to be looking at the world around them and be saying, what is the natural thing to do? What therefore is God's plan, his purpose, what fits in his intention for this universe, and so how should I be behaving? And Thomas Aquinas concluded that there is what we call a synderesis, if you like, a key precept. And he said this is revealed to us in nature. So it shows to us that this is God's intention. It shows this has come from the eternal law. And it is the synderesis that good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. And this is his key rule, that in every situation that you're in, good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. He believes that is what we can deduce from nature, so we can use our reasoning to interpret the natural world, the natural law, and that comes from the eternal law. That is what God wants us to do good and avoid evil. And from this, Aquinas concluded that there are 5 primary precepts that all human beings should be following. These are the conservation of life, the education of children, reproduction, the worship of God, and the ordering of society. So, for example, if we take that last point, the ordering of society, you could say, right, I'm looking at the natural world, I'm looking at things like lions, for example, and I'm seeing that there is a natural hierarchy. They've got this lead lion, I've forgotten what they're called, but they've got a lion that's in charge, and then there is this structure, you know, and then you've got like the cubs, are they called? The young lions at the bottom, and you've got that very clear structure of hierarchy, and you know, the males work their way up, or whatever they do, to the top, to then be like King of Pride Rock. I'm going a bit Lion King, but you know what I mean. So they're observing this hierarchy in nature and saying, right, well, that is what God's intention is. That's what we need to do. So then in society, there needs to be an order. And the whole point of this is that it will ensure that good is done and evil is avoided. Reproduction, for example. St. Thomas Aquinas would say, right, well, I'm seeing this in nature. Everything's reproducing, so human beings need to do that too. So the primary precepts are quite absolutist. They've got to be followed, and that is sort of within natural law, you've got different things. You've got a bit of deontology, a bit of teleology, you know, it's all in there, it's all thrown in there. But when you're looking at your primary precepts, always remember, Aquinas thought these are not up for negotiation. They've got to be followed, they've got to be applied. So you've got that key precept, which he believes influences his primary precepts. And then you've got your secondary precepts. So we've got a lot of this whole, you know, hierarchy that he's creating. We've got secondary precepts. And these are rules made by men based on those primary precepts. So for example, because it is a primary precept to conserve life, murder is wrong. For a Catholic, perhaps, abortion is then wrong because they see that as life and it's not being preserved. Also, for the reproduction one, a lot of Catholic, this is a key point. Catholic teaching all comes from natural moral law. They love it. Let me tell you, the Catholic Church are obsessed with natural moral law. So for the Church, because reproduction is on there, contraception is a no-no, because in case you didn't know, contraception stops reproduction. Homosexuality is a no-no, because in case you didn't know, 2 men sleeping together is not going to result in the possibility of life. You know, it's a 0% chance, let's be honest. So these are all reasons why the Catholic Church has been so critical of contraception, has been so critical of homosexuality, and then has been critical of abortion, because it appears to violate these 5 primary precepts from which natural law would say you derive your secondary precepts, which are a bit more applicable. So like, you can't murder, or homosexuality is wrong. So these are really, really key points in natural law. And it is very much a religious thing now. Maybe when Aristotle was proposing his ideas, he wasn't thinking of a god as such. Remember his idea of a prime mover. But now it's very much because of the Catholic influence, because St. Thomas Aquinas took it on and incorporated God and said God is the one controlling nature, that it is now a very religious concept. And Dessiner, he said that natural law, the discovery of natural law, is a meeting with God. So that actually, through nature, through natural law, man can know God. But I really want us to apply now this concept to the question. And the question, I remind you, is that it's situationalism, means it does not offer precise answers to difficult dilemmas. Because, of course, whilst you've got those very strong primary precepts, it is quite situational. It relies on your use of your reasoning to interpret nature to make the right decision. So it is situational. And so the question is asking, does that stop us having precise answers to difficult dilemmas? So can natural law ever say, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this? Because nature and interpretation, as we're going to see, is very subjective. So I want us to first look at a quote from Cicero, and he said that there will be one law eternal, binding upon all people at all times. So he believed that across all of human existence, across all of societies, there should be one law eternal, binding upon all people at all times. And many people would say that's natural law. The natural law is this eternal law. It is what we should all be following. But we have to ask, is natural law eternal? Is it unchangeable? Is it binding upon all people? Because we can all interpret things differently. We each have that individual reason and conscience, which means that we can't actually all be agreeing on the same things. We all think differently. Our thought processes are shaped by our different experiences, so we don't all see the same things. For example, in many cultures, homosexuality is seen as unnatural, it's seen as abnormal. In others, particularly Western societies, it is seen as normal. It is seen as a naturally occurring part of human existence. So there is a conflict on how people have interpreted nature. So can we say that natural law is that eternal law? On the one hand, many people would say, absolutely, it is. You know, I think Thomas Aquinas would very much have been saying, absolutely, there is one law, nature. We're all part of nature, we're all under that one law because it's all created by one God. But for other people, they'd say, well, hang on, you're using your individual reasoning. You're looking at nature, you know, different people looking at nature. How can we actually say that there is one law? Because if you look at different cultures, different countries, different people, there are so many different perspectives. So we can say that people have different views and interpretations of what is natural, so we cannot be explicit in our answers. We can't say, this is always natural, this is always unnatural. There is different thoughts, there's a lot of ambiguity, so it doesn't offer precise answers because it's based on your individual interpretation of what's actually natural. We could say it does offer precise answers to difficult dilemmas because of the flexibility it can still be used. Remember, this theory is 800 years old, but it's based on strong principles. So if you think like Aquinas' primary precepts, his synderesis, that good should be done and evil avoided, very strong, unchangeable principles. But these can then be applied to modern dilemmas. So you've got your primary precepts, but then you have got a bit more free rein with your secondary precepts. So we could argue that whilst it has a very strong grounding, it can still be applied to difficult dilemmas today because the individual has the guidance, but they've then got the individual power to be making conclusions about the world. So it can still be applied to modern dilemmas, giving application to modern life even today, 800 years on. It could be argued it does not offer those precise answers because its situationalism undermines the supposedly divine origins of natural law. Aquinas, very clear, you've got that eternal law. So this natural law comes from a powerful creator God. Now, if you're going along that route, how can it be situational? How can we say, oh, well, this seems like it's natural, this isn't, in different situations, in different places? Surely we should be supporting Cicero and saying that it is eternal and unchangeable. One God, one set of rules for everybody. But natural law is situational. It's all about your reason in accordance with nature. It's all about those secondary precepts that you are yourself deducing and taking away. So does that undermine the divine origins of it? You know, this idea that God has these exact commands and he's manifested all of this in nature. But we're saying, well, it's all about your use of reason. So that undermines the idea of one objective sense of right and wrong. So does it have to be more clear? Does it have to be more explicit? Should there be less ambiguity? But if that is the case, then what is the role of reasoning? A couple of other points that we could be making as well, because if it is to incorporate reasoning, and both Aristotle and then Aquinas, remember, he said it is the sharing in the eternal law by rational creatures. if that rational aspect of us, if our reasoning is being used and incorporated, then it has to be situational, because we don't all think in the same way. It is down to your individual use of reason to interpret nature in that situation, to decide what is a natural thing. Goodness is what is natural, fulfilling what is natural. How do we know? Using that reason. And this is in keeping with Catholic teaching. The Catholic Church teaches that the conscience is the voice of God inside every man. So if every person has got this voice of God, if they've got this sense of the divine, of this conscience, of this rationality within them, then they've got to use it. And natural law then has to be situational, because everybody seems to have a different conscience, a different source of reasoning and rational reflection, shaped by our own unique experiences and our unique worldview. So it has to be situational to allow for you to use your individual conscience. Otherwise, what would be the point? Why would we have one if we're just all following one strict rule anyway? And this allows a more holistic approach to Christian decision making. Christianity today does not say you have to just follow this one source of teaching. It gives a more holistic approach. So you're looking at nature, but you're also using your own reflection, your own reasoning, your own conscience. And so we could argue that in response to our statement that it does not offer precise answers to difficult dilemmas, we could say it does, because it's based on very strong principles, but then it's a lot more flexible in allowing the individual to themselves think and come to conclusions based on their interpretation of nature and that consultation with their conscience. So it's a real balancing act, natural law, because we have got those very strict elements to it, but at the same time it is situational. It's based on your reasoning and your interpretation of nature. We can interpret the natural law in very different ways. So those are some key points on natural law. But I always try and remember that natural law is all about fulfilling God's law by adherence to strict principles based on rational interpretation of nature. It is a bit of a mouthful, I know, but if you just remember that it's based on quite strict principles which are formulated, we believe, through an interpretation of nature, so of what's natural, because someone who follows natural law would argue that nature reveals the eternal law. So you've got eternal, divine, natural, human. And then you've got your synderesis, your primary precepts, and your secondary precepts. But it is quite a tricky topic. I think it's probably the trickiest, most difficult on the paper. So thank goodness we've got it done straight away. And please do stay with me, because I hope you haven't been put off by that. I love the next question. It is, to what extent is Kant's ethical teaching helpful in resolving all ethical problems? And the key word that must be jumping out at you whenever you see Kant is duty. He was passionate about doing your duty. He was all about deontology. It was all about the act itself. In every situation, we're looking at the morality of the act that you are doing. And he believed that in every situation, you have a duty to do. You've got a duty to do the right thing. He said, he put it very clearly, he said, do the right thing because it is right. Do the right thing because it is right. So there can be no other influences on your decision making at all. Absolutely not. It is all about doing the right thing because it is right. It's got to be objectively necessary in itself. It's very strict, so it's not about the consequences. So whereas situation ethics, which we're going to come on to, is all about, will the outcome produce a loving effect? Will the outcome be the most loving thing to do? Kant says, I don't care what else is going on, that action itself. So we always have the classic example with this, which is if you've got a axeman murderer at the door and he is saying to you, is Ben in? He says, is he in? And you know, if you say yes, that, well, he's going to come in and kill me. But if you say no, you're lying. So if you were to ask Kant, what should I do? Kant would say, well, it's all about the deontology. It is your duty to tell the truth in every situation, because even if the consequence is going to be bad, and it is, you're going to get me killed, it's not acceptable. You have to do the right thing in that situation. It has to be deontological. So, for example, you would have to say, yes, he is, because if you lied, that's not good, but telling the truth is. So it's all about it objectively in that one act itself. And he said, an action as objectively necessary in itself without reference to any other purpose. So he doesn't care about any emotion you might be feeling. He doesn't care about the consequences of that action. It's saying, is that one singular act, for example, telling the truth or lying or stealing, is that moral? Are you doing your duty? Are you doing the right thing in that action? If the answer is no, no matter what your justification, you can't do it. So here's another little case study. So imagine a mother is on the breadline and she has got no money whatsoever, in absolute poverty, and she's got a little baby. And if that baby doesn't have some food within the next hour or so, it's probably going to die. And so she's in a shop and she's all this baby food, so many tins, and she thinks, you know what, I'm just going to have to steal one. I'm going to have to take one to feed my baby, to save my baby's life. You know, they only cost like 40p, but she's got no money whatsoever, so she's going to have to steal it. She feels she's got no other option. Kant would say, no, I don't care if your baby then dies. Stealing is wrong, so you can't do it, because that action is wrong. So deontologically, the act itself of stealing is wrong, no matter what the justification, no matter what the consequences. It is a very, very strict theory of ethics. And I always ask, well, why? Why is Kant being so disciplined? Now, when you look into his life, he lived a very strict life. He loved a bit of routine. But he said something really interesting. He said, man must be disciplined, for by nature he is raw and wild. So we can say here that Kant is showing us how he wants to be so committed to discipline. We've got to be disciplined. We've got to have objective standards of morality. It can't be about, in this situation you could do this, in this situation you could do this, because he thinks that by nature we're raw and wild, so we can't be trusted to make that right decision based on all those influences and options. Instead, he's very clear, we have to be disciplined, we have to do our duty, and we've got to think about ethics deontologically. It's all about that specific action and not ever about the consequences or the context or the circumstances. It's got to be objectively necessary in itself. And he said that when we're doing these actions, there are two kinds of imperatives in them. There is the hypothetical imperative and there is the categorical imperative. And this is about what motivates your action. So it's a variation. The hypothetical is if. So it's saying, I will do this if. Whereas the categorical is that categorically, in every situation, you've got to do it. So the hypothetical is always based on something else. So it's, you know, if I need to do this, or if this happens, I will do this. So I will do this if, and it's always based on the circumstances. So it's like, well, unless, you know, there is an axe man, I will always try and tell the truth. You know, I'll always do it. If the situation is right, if it will produce good results. Whereas the categorical is, I will always tell the truth. I will always do this. And the distinction here is that you can universalise the categorical. So the hypothetical is always dependent on the situation. So it's like, right, well, in this situation, I will do this, I will do this, I will do this. The categorical is that in every situation you will do it. And this is where Kant's idea of universalisation comes in. He believed that every single thing you do can or should be universalised. And that means that whatever you do, if every single person on the planet did it, would the world be a better place? So, for example, if that woman, the poor woman with the baby, did steal, she would have to think before picking that up, she has to go, if all 7 billion people stole like I am doing now, would the world be a better place? And the answer is no, of course. You know, if everybody stole, then society wouldn't work. If everybody lied, then society wouldn't work. If everybody murdered, then society would not work. So you have to ask, does my specific action, would that apply to everybody? So if every single person did it, would the world be a better place? Would we still have a good, composed moral order? And if the answer is no, then you yourself can't do it, because Kant said there can be no exceptions. There has to be complete conformity. Everybody has to be subjected to the same rules. So under no conditions can you lie. Under no conditions can you steal? Because if everybody started doing that, where would the world be? And he said, your principle of action be made a law for the whole world. He said, live your life as though your every act were to become a universal law. So if everything you did became a universal law, so if, oh well, just today, because I've got no money, but I really want that dairy milk, so I'm just going to steal it. If that became a law that you can steal dairy milk, what would happen? If that were a universal law, what would happen? And we realise, well, society wouldn't function. It'd be anarchy. It'd be chaos. So if you're going to do it, it's got to be the same as every single other person on this planet. And that is the whole idea of it being categorical. It's not based on if. So it's not saying, in this situation, in this context. He says, no, it's got to be absolute. It's got to be one fundamental shared sense of right and wrong that everybody follows. Every single person on this planet follows. Your principle of action be made a law for the whole world, living your life as though your every act were to become a universal law. So they are the key points, really, of Kantian ethics. The idea that you're doing the right thing because it is right, that the only good thing is the good will, so it's the intention to do the right thing as opposed to thinking about the consequences. It's then also about deontology, so also on that act itself, that action as objectively necessary, about the need for discipline, for everybody to be doing the same thing, that universalisation in keeping with your hypothetical as a no and your categorical as a yes. The reason we're doing it commanding, we have to all be doing the same thing. There are to be no exceptions to the rule, and you can only do your duty. You can't have any emotion involved in your decision making. It's all about doing your duty. You have a duty to do the right thing, no matter what your emotion is, no matter what the outcomes could be. It's all about doing the right thing in every single situation. That act itself in keeping with your duty, if every single person followed that same principle. So, to what extent is this helpful in resolving all ethical problems? We could say it's good because it's objective, that the idea of duty means that you consistently do the right thing and that emotion doesn't cloud your judgment. So we can be sure we're doing the right thing in every situation because we're following a very strict, objective source of moral authority and guidance. We are not letting our judgment be clouded by emotion, so it's not subjective to each situation. We're making sure we're always doing the right thing. So it ensures that we are consistent and objective, so there is no way in which we can't make the right decision. Of course, in some situations, this can seem inhuman, and this leads us on to our second point, because we're arguing against it now. We're saying, well, it seems inhuman to just be doing your duty, to just be doing what every other 7 billion person should be doing in each situation. This idea that man must be disciplined. Is it not part of the human being's life to have emotion, to be in unique situations? You know, we don't live in a world where we're just going about the same tasks and things all day, every day. There are going to be unique situations. And surely in these cases, your values, your emotions will come into play. Is that not a part of being a human being? So where is the compassion, for example? We're looking at Joseph Fletcher in just a minute, and he was very clear that love should rule all your decision making. For Kant, that's an absolute no. No room for emotion, no room for thought about the consequences and outcomes. It's an emotionless duty. And, you know, what are the consequences of that? What's he saying about human life and how we should live? A strength is that it has consistency across all cultures and continents. It is this idea of universalization, that every action, wherever done in the world, should conform to this one sense of right or wrong. So everywhere murder is wrong, everywhere lying is wrong. And that gives us a very clear sense of right and wrong around the world. We don't get into a situation where we're like, oh, but in this country I can do this, but in this culture I can't do this. Everywhere, wherever you are, you have to conform to that universal sense of right and wrong. And that, of course, gives us a very real equality, which is absolutely a positive thing. It means that, you know, nobody can be taken advantage of, there's no discrimination, there's no, you know, exceptions to the rule. It ensures a really strict equality in the enforcement of rules. So like punishment, saying, you know, well, in this situation he could have done that, but he's done the same thing, but his situation was very different. That's not allowed. You have to follow a very strict set of rules, and that then gives that universal equality and that universally shared idea of what is right and what is wrong. There's no ambiguity. We're all very, very clear about that. But does Kant not take into account that everybody is different? He is saying that we should all follow the same rules all the time, everywhere we are. But is that actually what we're like as a species? For example, homosexuality in some cultures very much accepted. In other cultures, you will be given capital punishment for practicing it. So where do we have that shared sense of the rightness or wrongness? Now, on the flip side of that, we do share some values. There are a lot of values that all cultures share. And the humanist A.J. Ayer said, it is very likely that our basic moral principles would be the same because human beings have evolved to live in groups. So if you're really trying to go for that evaluation here, you could say that whilst it is likely our basic moral principles would be the same because human beings have evolved to live in groups, suggesting Kant is right to say we should all universally share the same moral principles, it could be argued, and then you could go on to say, that morality is very subjective in this world. There are lots of different religions, beliefs and ideas, and so we can't just say this is right, this is wrong. It tends to be, in our world today, more of a sliding scale, you know, different religions, different points of view, and that is something that needs to be accepted. So we can't just have one sense of morality when we are all so different. We can also add to that and say that Kant says you should have the courage to use your own understanding. But how can you do that? Because everybody thinks differently, and he says that you've just got to do the right thing in every situation. You could argue he's saying we've got to be like robots. There's no room for emotion. We don't think about the particular circumstance. We're just doing that same action again and again. It's quite robotic. And where is that own understanding? He assumes that if we all use our reasoning, we'll all come to the same conclusion that, yes, this is the right thing to do. Oh, yes, that is my duty. But we're not, are we? All 7 billion people are not going to conclude on the same things as we see in the world on a daily basis. So is he flawed there? You know, how can we all share that same sense of duty when our minds think very differently, when our rational reflection and reasoning brings us to very different conclusions? A final weakness is that there are going to be exceptions, and this is a key point. Like the axeman at the door, like the poor mother in the supermarket desperate to feed her child, there are always going to be exceptions. Life is filled with circumstances when, you know, to do the right thing is not necessarily to follow the rules. You have got to do something different. You know, because you know that's the right thing, and just because it doesn't conform to the rules, and just because every single one of the 7 billion people on this planet couldn't do it, in that situation, that specific action may just be required to do the right thing in that case, and Kant just does not accept that at all. He says in every situation you've got to do the right thing. And whilst on the whole, maybe that makes your ethical decision making better, and it means, you know, you're more consistent, as we've said, in those particular unique situations, what are the consequences of that? Surely we do have to intervene at times and say, well, hang on, in this very extraordinary circumstance, we've got to change things up a bit. And I think even, you know, the Catholic Church, for example, lots of organisations who are quite set in their thinking on issues will say there are extraordinary circumstances, and arguably Kant doesn't do that with this strict deontological, duty-based system of ethics. A final strength, though, is that it ensures we protect human life. With all of this, the duty, you can't ever use anything or anyone as a means to an end. He said every man is to be respected as an absolute end to himself, demonstrating to us there that you can never use human beings to achieve something. So you can't use slave labour, for example, to get more profits or produce cheaper products. You have to treat each individual as the individual that they are. So from a human rights perspective, you could say it's a very good theory at conserving the rights of every single individual. We're going to move on to question C now, question 3, and it is that situation ethics is neither Christian nor believable. Discuss. There are 3 key figures that always come to mind when you think of situation ethics. We start with Jesus Christ himself, the man himself. He's the one that started it all off, the key Christian figure. And he said, very famously, as you know, love your neighbour as yourself. Then, at the start of the 20th century, William Temple is a key figure. He's a former Archbishop of Canterbury. And he said that it is axiomatic that love should be the predominant Christian impulse. So he was saying that in every situation, in every circumstance, love should be the key impulse. Love should be what you are acting on. And then Joseph Fletcher, in about the 1960s, he actually took Jesus' teachings. He took Jesus as the key role model of his ethical theory. His theory was all about emulating Jesus' core teaching. He then took William Temple, and he was saying, right, he's got a lot of good to say, and he incorporated all of that into situation ethics. And Joseph Fletcher said, love is the only universal, and said, love alone, when well served, is always right in every situation. So situation ethics is all about love. In every situation, in every circumstance, a Christian should, because of the example set by Jesus, because Jesus lived a life based on love, of love your neighbour as yourself, you know, he broke rules in order to do the most loving thing. Joseph Fletcher said, right, the Christian must emulate this, and in every area of their life, in every single situation, they must show love. Love should be guiding their decision making. So it shouldn't be about natural law and its interpretation of the rules of nature. It shouldn't be about doing your duty or doing your deontological duty in that situation, following those strict rules and expectations the whole world should observe. He was saying love is the only universal, and it is a love that should be used in every single decision-making situation, that love should be motivating. As Temple said, it's the predominant Christian impulse. They should always be thinking, what is the most loving thing to do? What will show the most love? What will bring about the most loving consequences? Because it is a teleological theory of ethics about the loving thing to do. So you will do an action which you think will bring about the most good for people, because it's believed that is what Jesus Christ did, and the Christian, as a follower of Christ, seeks to emulate his example in the world. Now, it is grounded in Christ, it is grounded in Jesus Christ, love as that key Christian value that should govern the whole of Christian life. Now, you can argue that a lot of Christian churches have not really placed love at the centre of their teachings. For example, you know, the Catholic Church uses natural moral law, you know, very strict, often based on those laws of nature that are apparently present, not really on that emotion of love. Although Pope Francis, I would definitely say, is quite a modern example of where he is trying to apply love as that key Christian decision-making impulse, but at the same time trying to follow natural law and those strict principles it teaches. There are key points that you need to know. There are 4 working principles, and there are then 6 principles. And here they are. We have the 4 working principles, which are personalism, which is that it should be based on people. So it's all about people, not principles. So instead of following rules or ideas, it's all about doing the loving thing for the people. Positivism, it's all about God's love, a very positive thing. It's all about pragmatism, doing the most practical thing in that situation. And all about relativism, so it's relative to what you can actually do. So doing the most loving thing that you can do in that situation. And then we have the key principles that the principles are in the propositions which underline the whole of situation ethics. Examples include that love's decisions are made situationally, not prescriptively. So nobody can sit down and go, that's loving, that's loving, that's loving, that's not loving, and then send out that rule book. It's all about the situation. You can't prescribe what's loving. It's all about, in that situation, deciding what's the most loving thing to do. Another of the propositions is that the only good thing is love, that love equals justice, so to do the most loving thing is to do the most just thing, and that only the end justifies the means, and that the ruling norm of Christian decision making is love, nothing else. So that idea of love being the predominant Christian impulse, that in every Christian decision made, love should be the key factor involved. And it is important that we do take a look at the teleology of this, because William Temple said, the morality of an action is dependent on the circumstances. So it is not this set of rules, as we said, that's prescriptively applied. It is about following those unique, not following. It's about looking at the unique situation and asking, based on that fundamental value of love, what is the right thing to do? So there are no rules, there's just one core value, which is love. So what do we think? Is it Christian? Is it believable? We can say that it certainly is, because it's based wholly on Jesus Christ and mirroring his leadership. And this is the point of Christian life. To be a Christian is to be a follower of Christ. So what would you naturally do? You would follow that individual. You try and replicate, emulate and embody their message, their morals, and follow their teachings. And if the core teaching of Jesus Christ is to love your neighbour as yourself, then what should a Christian do? Love their neighbour as themselves. And what does situation ethics say? That in every situation you should be loving your neighbour as yourself. Now we could argue, this is your weakness now, your next point, that, well, how do we actually know what the most loving thing to do is? How can we actually define love? It is hugely subjective. And so what I think is the most loving thing, you might think, really? So, how can we all agree? How can we actually say this is loving? We can't. We don't know. So does that create ambiguity, create uncertainty, and start to undermine the credibility of the theory? Remember, we're asking, is it believable? Well, how do we actually know what love is? We could say a strength is that it is accessible to everyone. So in every situation, even if you can't get out your Bible and check all your quotes, even if you've not got a degree in theology, even if you've not had an audience one-to-one with the Pope on what is Christian ethical practice in 2017, it can be used. So we could say a lot of the rules, the strict rules in the Bible, for example, are outdated. You could say that natural law, some of that is not really applicable. Things like reproduction in a society where you've got a massive surplus of young children, and a massive population that the society can't cope with looking after, is it really a primary precept to keep reproducing? Do we not have to intervene at some point? And you could say, well, situation ethics is so flexible that absolutely you can. So whilst a lot of other Christian teaching and methods of decision making are very dogmatic, so that means they really stick to strict rules, situation ethics is a lot more free and open and flexible, and that means it retains its relevance wherever you are and whenever you are, because that unchanging value of love is always there. It does not change, but then you can apply that principle in every single situation. So it's always got relevance, you know. So even though Jesus was talking 2,000 years ago, when there weren't computers, you know, there weren't factories, there wasn't a multinational business empires. Oh, excuse me. What we can say, oh good Lord, what we can say is that that principle of love can still be applied in all sorts of situations and contexts today, whereas other theories of ethics are a lot more dogmatic, a lot less flexible, and so a lot less applicable. Joseph Fletcher said that rules should be illuminators, not directors. So the rules should just influence and inspire our decisions. It should not be the directing, the key factor in our decision making. We don't have to stick to those rules. They should guide us to do the most loving thing. However, you could argue that we actually do need rules. Cicero said there should be one law eternal, as we know. Kant said, as we know, man must be disciplined, for by nature he's raw and wild. So perhaps we do actually need rules. The Bible outlines 10 commandments, suggesting that the Christian faith believes people do need a sense of rules. You know, of course we do. In order to live harmoniously, in order to cooperate, surely we do need rules. Every single society has got some sort of rule structure. There's nowhere in the world that just says, no, just do the most loving thing. There are rules, and they are needed to bring about cohesion, cooperation, harmony within a society, within a community. There needs to be that strict guidance and a sense of, well, if you don't follow this, this will happen. So maybe we do need rules, which means, you know, situation ethics is not believable. It's a nice idea, it's nice in, you know, in thought, but if you are actually going to apply it in the real world, are we not just going to end up with a bit of anarchy? Also, it's so teleological, so we can't predict the outcomes. So I might think what I'm going to do is going to be loving, but the outcome, the actual outcome, could be very different. There could be unintended consequences. So whilst Kant was very sure that, well, as long as you're doing a good act, that's all that matters. Don't worry about the consequences, but if the action you did conforms to that strict sense of morality, then you're fine. Whereas, of course, with something like situation ethics, you're basing it on a prediction. You can't predict the future. You don't actually know what that loving outcome is going to be. So anything really could happen. And then a really interesting point to throw in there, if you go in for that higher level, what's his name? Joseph Fletcher. He said that there is no conscience. He said there is no conscience. Conscience is simply the attempt to make decisions. So he said there is no conscience. He said the traditional error lies in thinking about the conscience as a noun instead of a verb. So he said the conscience is not a thing. It's just something we do. So it's the human attempt to make decisions. Now, as we know, this is completely at odds with the Christian teaching. The Catholic Church teaches the conscience is the voice of God inside every man. So the Church does teach, excuse me, that there is a conscience within every single person. So for Fletcher to pop along and say, there's no conscience, it's just what we say is our attempt to make decisions. So it's just describing the process of trying to make decisions creatively and fittingly. That is not an actual thing. And of course, for a Catholic, for a Christian believer, they do believe in a conscience, that there is a conscience within them. And so It's not Christian, many would argue, because it does not take into account the existence or the role of a conscience. So that is a major issue for Joseph Fletcher's situation ethics, that he's not including the conscience. However, we can say that we do all agree that love is such a positive force, and so we can always apply it. As we've said, it's flexible and it can be applied specifically to different circumstances. And as Fletcher said himself, love is the only universal. So if we're basing decisions on a universal value, then surely we're going to all be on the same page. It's going to be appropriate, and crucially, it's going to retain its relevance, as opposed to very certain rules which only apply in a certain context, because when times change, society changes. You know, we have different structures in place. We've got new businesses, new ways of thinking, new technology, that if you've got just strict rules, very specific rules, they can no longer be applied. But it is important, because we have said quite a lot of bad things. We've sort of destroyed it and said, well, it's, you know, based on just a broad value, you know, no one knows what to do, you just don't know what's going to be loving. And we've said, well, Christians aren't really impressed because there's no conscience, and the Bible has got strict rules. But let's give it a bit of credit. You know, it's based on that universal value. It's based on Jesus Christ. It seeks to emulate Jesus Christ, and it does empower the individual to be making decisions based on what they think is a loving thing to do. And let's be honest, you know, love is a key human value that we do all take into account. And those working principles of personalism, positivism, pragmatism and relativism do give it some grounding. It's not literally a case of love, off you go, that's all you get. There is some certainty anchoring it down, if you like. And it has got a lot of support. So St. Paul, for example, did say that the greatest of these, the greatest value, is love. So maybe a Christian should be prioritising love. But do they need more rules? We're going to move away from the religious ethical decision making of situation ethics and move on to what I think is a fascinating theory. It's utilitarianism. This is question 4, it's D. And the question is, to what extent is utilitarianism helpful? So how does it help us to live a truly moral life? So again, it's looking at these key ethical theories and asking, well, what is the theory? What are the ideas? Who are our key thinkers? And then how can we apply it to everyday situations? So a little top tip for you in the exam, try and put in some examples. Give them examples of this theory in action. They're very abstract concepts. You know, it's all about people sitting down and coming up with theories. How does it actually apply in the world today? In what situations could the theory be used? And would the outcomes be what we want? You know, does it prove it's successful, or does its application prove it's actually a flawed theory that they've not really thought through? And I say this because utilitarianism, I would say, is majorly applied today. It is so widespread, you know, so popular today because it's based on happiness. And I do think we live, at least in the West, in a hedonistic society. We live in a world where happiness is seen as a good thing that we want to attain. And we also live in a democracy in the Western world, which is all about the majority ruling. It's the majority's decision taken. So it's not like one dictator or one individual deciding. It's the voice of the masses which is taken. And these two principles, so the greatest number of people, the majority, and happiness, are basically the two key components that make up utilitarianism and this key idea of how we make those moral decisions. And utilitarianism was first proposed by Jeremy Bentham, a very interesting man. Get on Google if you've got a spare minute and have a look at some of his ideas and what he's done for society. And he proposed what we call act utilitarianism. And he said that nature, the laws of nature, have placed us under two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. So he identified these two key masters that govern us, pleasure and pain. And he said that we are naturally inclined towards the pleasure and the happiness, and we are naturally pushed away from, if you like, the pain. We don't want it. That is what human life is all about. And so he based this moral decision making on a key principle, and we call this the principle of utility. And this is as follows. This is a quote from him. He said, "The greatest happiness of the greatest number is the measure of right and wrong." So we can decide what the right thing to do is by ensuring we bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So as much happiness as you can for as many people as you can. And Bentham thought that we could make ethical decisions quantifiable. And what this means is that we can actually calculate them, so it makes it quite scientific. We can calculate what ethical decisions to make, what conclusions we should be coming to. And he did this through what he called the philosophic calculus. And this is his way of calculating what will bring about the greatest happiness or the most pleasure for the greatest number. So let's break that calculus down, shall we? So we had this philosophic calculus, and it was a way of scientifically calculating according to the criteria that he set out. And I've got the notes here, don't you worry. So on there we have got duration. So you've got to ask, how long will a happiness last? We've got intensity. So how intense will it be? We've got proximity. How near or remote will it be? Extent. How widely will it cover? Certainty. How probable is it? Purity. How free from pain is it? And future. Will it lead to future pleasure? How much future pleasure will it lead to? And they are based on that principle of utility, which judges any action to be right to the tendency it appears to have or diminish the happiness of the party whose interests are in question. And that calculus, he believes, should be used in every situation. So can you imagine today? He'd probably create an app, wouldn't he? Be there on the app store with his app, and you'd get your calculus up and you'd put all your bits in. So you'd be like, right, what's the duration? What's the extent? What's the purity? What's the future happiness? Put it all in, calculate. Oh, does that create the greatest happiness for the greatest number? So he'd probably do it on a little app like that. So he genuinely believed that you should be calculating the greatest happiness for the greatest number, what will bring that about in each situation, and that should shape your decision making. Now, let's be honest, it's a lovely idea in practice. As we've said, it's based on ensuring that most people, the majority of people, are happy, which today, in today's world, we see that as key. Democracy, you know, the party that gets the most votes, the party the majority want, is in power. We go with the majority rules. That is our key form of decision making in the Western world today. So that gets a big thumbs up. And happiness as well, as we've said, it's the key motivator. You ask anybody, you know, what do you want in life? To be happy is going to come up on there. So that's brilliant. But is it actually practical? He's making it quantifiable, yes. But when I'm in everyday situations, when I'm in that shop, when I'm in the park, you know, when I'm confronted by that axe murderer, am I really going to go, just hang on 1 minute, let me just check, let me do the calculations. Is it a nice theory in principle, but what about in practice? Well, before we get worried about that, before we have a moment to crucify Bentham, let me introduce to you John Stuart Mill. Now, John Stuart Mill, another fascinating man. He was not impressed with nature. He said that nature kills. He said that we must live in a designedly imperfect world. So you could say, actually, just to make a synoptic link, if you're going back to natural law, you could say John Stuart Mill said that nature kills. He was not convinced that nature is a good thing. And you could say, well, just because something's natural doesn't mean that it is right. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later with utilitarianism, actually, because utilitarianism says we naturally want pleasure, happiness, and we naturally want to avoid pain. But we're going to be asking, does that make it right? But just a quick synoptic link there. You could be saying, on John Stuart Mill, he said nature kills. He said nature is not good. Nature commits all the crimes for which men are hanged. You know, natural disasters kill hundreds of people. Nature is not as good as we thought. So for him, we should actually be rejecting and rebelling against nature as opposed to trying to emulate it. So, I'm so glad we've got that. So get yourself back to natural law, get that little synoptic link in. Remember, always be trying to make some links, bringing in more key scholars and key thinkers where and when possible. And if you're still with us, if you started on natural law and you're still here, you deserve that synoptic link. That's going to give you a good couple of marks more. Fab. So we're talking about utilitarianism, and we've introduced Bentham. Now we're on to John Stuart Mill. Bless him. Because he looked at what Bentham was saying and he thought, you know what, you've got a good idea. But he said, society needs rules in order to operate. He said, we can't just base it on, these individual calculations. It's not going to work. We need rules. And so he incorporated the principle of utility into his decision-making model. And we call his utilitarianism rule utilitarianism. Why, I hear you ask? Let me tell you. Because it's all about following the rule leading to the greatest balance of good over evil or pleasure over pain. So it's which rule is going to do that. So, right, I'm in that situation, like, right, what rule will lead to it? So instead of having to calculate it all, it's about the general principle or rule. So that is key, more modern adaptation, interpretation of utilitarianism. But it's been built on even more by Peter Singer, who is still alive today. And he developed the idea of preference utilitarianism because he thought this is all a little bit selfish. It's a little bit all about you. It's you deciding what's going to create pleasure, what's going to take pain. And he thought you need to take it outside of yourself. It needs to become that little bit more objective. And he said that you should seek to do the good even though it may not be in your best interest. So you've got to create the greatest pleasure, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, but you've got to not include your own interests. So it's a lot more objective in the conclusions it then comes to. He said, my own needs and interests cannot count any more than the needs of others. So it's about being a bit more selfless. And he said that ethical judgments must be made from a universal point of view. So when you're calculating pleasure and pain, happiness for the greatest number, it can't include you or your personal thoughts. You've got to be a lot more strict in your application. Your own emotions can't be getting in the way. Ethical judgments must be made from a universal point of view. I think you might get on quite well with Kant, and following those strict utilitarian principles, but in a stricter way. So not getting yourself involved, not thinking, you can't do that. You've got to be very strict in your application of utilitarianism as the greatest happiness for the greatest number without concern for your own preferences. So let's talk about utilitarianism and whether it is helpful in living that truly moral life. A strength is it's based on happiness, and as we've said, it is recognised by all cultures, all people, that happiness is an important thing to us. We all want happiness, and especially in today's world. This is why I think utilitarianism is so relevant today, because we do live in a culture which prioritises happiness. We say, do what makes you happy. You should be happy. It's normal to be happy. We want you to enjoy life. So that is why utilitarianism is successful, because happiness is a key human value that we all recognise, that we all want. So if utilitarianism is all about achieving the most happiness, then surely that is a successful model of decision making. However, a weakness could then be that other things do need to be considered. This is called a naturalistic fallacy, that just because we desire happiness, just because happiness seems to come naturally, it doesn't make it right. For example, there could be other factors involved. Kant, for example, as we know, said, no way, you do not let emotion get in the way of your decision making. So whilst maybe Peter Singer and his utilitarianism would be more favourable, unacceptable to Kant, this idea that you're basing your decisions on happiness as opposed to your duty alone would be a no-no for Kant, especially because it's all about the greatest happiness for the greatest number, what are the future consequences, what are the outcomes, he'd be saying, no, it's meant to be deontological, that act itself. So Kant might be shaking his head just a little bit there. Other things do need to be considered, so we do have other factors. It might be love, for example, it might be duty, it might be responsibility, as opposed to happiness. Some people can think, just chasing happiness is too hedonistic, it's quite selfish. It's not necessarily a correlation between what we desire and what is right. So you've got to keep that in mind, that other factors may need to be considered. A strength, however, is that the theory is secular. You'll notice it's just based on human values of happiness and of that principle of the majority. So quite a democratic thing. There is no reference to a God. There's no reference to an eternal law. There's no need to follow a divine figure like Jesus. It is all about a secular approach to quantifiable decision making. It's very well justified. It's saying, right, well, we're under these sovereign masters of pleasure and pain. The majority of people should be happy because that's how cohesive society works. And so this is how we're going to follow through with it. There is nothing in there about religion. And so every single person of all faiths and none can follow it. So it's very much widely applied because it's secular and it doesn't require any metaphysical belief in order to be followed. It's very practical, very relevant to the real world, doesn't require any belief in a God, for example. However, a weakness is that it can lead potentially to a tyranny of the majority. So it gets us to a position where we're saying, because the majority want it, it's right. And this can lead to an abuse of minorities. So, for example, only about 10% of the population are gay. So they are a statistical minority. That can lead to an abuse. People could say, oh, well, we don't care. They're not the majority. The 90% of us, the greatest pleasure for us would be this. So we don't need to think about them. Same could be said for the use of slave labour. It could get to a position where you're saying, well, 10 children need to die in factory machines, but 2 million people are going to get cheap clothes in that well-known high street store. So, if you're saying the majority, it's a no-brainer. You'd be saying, oh, 2 million people, doesn't matter about 10 at their expense if that's going to produce the greatest happiness. So minorities can become victims and can be forgotten about, and their needs can be ignored because of this relentless focus on the majority. And what the majority want might not necessarily be right. People are just following the crowd, getting swept up in a movement and not actually doing the right thing. A strength, however, is that it is quantifiable. You can calculate it with accuracy. So you can be assured that you're doing the right thing. You can get a good picture of your decision and you can be justifying it. It's very good to justify. You say, well, this shows me this, in the future this will happen, the duration of it will be this. So you can quantify it easily. However, a weakness, we could say, is that it is actually not providing us with too much clarity. It's hard to actually measure, it's time consuming to measure, and we can't actually predict the consequences well. So when we're talking about the duration or about the future happiness, we can't actually know with real certainty what that will be. We can't have a security in our peace of mind about what the outcomes will be. Things could change, things could go very differently. So you've got utilitarianism with its three key components, Bentham, John Stuart Mill and Singer, and then you've got a whole host of evaluation points, lots of strengths to it, but actually quite a few weaknesses. And if you're going for that tyranny of the majority, the naturalistic fallacy, and whether it is actually practical and can be applied, you're getting some really good criticisms in there. And like I say, you can be making those links. You could be saying, well, actually Kant's saying it's all about duty in that specific circumstance with people used as a means to an end in themselves, as an end to themselves, not used as a means to an end, but as a positive, practical philosophy based on widely recognised values, happiness, and the idea of the majority ruling, the majority as the norm. So really interesting to have had a little meander, if you like, through natural law, through Kantian ethics, through situation ethics and utilitarianism. All the basics there. How does this all then apply? So our final question is about euthanasia, and on the OCR course from which these key topics have been taken, you can be asked on euthanasia or business ethics, and it's all about how do we apply these key philosophies to real world, real life situations that we're all familiar with. And the question is, situationalism is the best method of assessing whether euthanasia is morally acceptable. So for your application questions, what we're looking at is an understanding of the key idea itself. So for example, the key idea is euthanasia, so you need to show a key understanding of the key concepts involved. Don't know why I keep saying key, but so for example, we'd be looking at explanations of voluntary euthanasia, passive euthanasia, non-voluntary euthanasia, being in a permanent vegetative state, and then looking at concepts like the sanctity of life, so its religious origins, so the idea of life being holy, belonging to God, so it must be conserved, and also looking at more secular approaches, things like the quality of life and how we measure that, and whether quality of life could ever justify euthanasia, you know, whether your quality of life gets to a state where we can then say, right, you're going to have to euthanize this individual, or say, yes, okay, they can have euthanasia if that's what they would like. And then, of course, trying to bring in your key thinkers. With euthanasia, we're always applying situation ethics and natural law. So, of course, situation ethics would very much be saying, in that situation, is it the most loving thing to do, and for who? So for the victim, for the patient, is it the most loving thing to do? For the family, is it the most loving thing to do? And again, how do we know what loving is? Is it loving to stop the pain? Would it be loving to prolong their life? You know, is there any hope for the future? What would Jesus do? That key question whenever we're talking about situation ethics and Christian decision making. And then natural law, the idea that, well, goodness is something fulfilling its nature. So is it natural to kill? Of course, we look straight at that primary precept and it's telling us absolutely not. In no circumstance, you know, the preservation of life is so, so important. How on earth could we then justify ending a life? We are choosing to end that life. That violates that key precept, the primary precept. Of course, suicide was very much frowned upon by the church up until very recently, because it was saying it's not your decision whether to end your life, it's God's decision. And you are violating that primary precept of the preservation of life. So it was seen like murder. You know, you are not allowed to do that, was the teaching. So to then take a look at the precepts and say, right, well, how would the individual use that reasoning? Remember, this is where natural law becomes a lot more situational, because it is about your individual use of reasoning. And it's about asking, to what extent do we stick to those rigid primary precepts? And what does nature tell us? You know, nature, do we, as a human society, want to say we'll allow suffering at any cost because that's supposedly natural? Or is the kind of thing to do, the more loving thing to do, to intervene? Or do we just let nature take its course? For example, it gets interesting when it's about being on life support. Is it natural to keep somebody on a life support machine? Or is it the most loving thing to do, the right thing to do in a circumstance, to remove that treatment and to literally let nature take its course, for that person to then die if they're not on that support, if they're not taking that specific medication or course of treatment? But would that be loving? You know, how would the family feel about their relative being taken off that support? Would that be a loving thing to do, to consciously choose to end their life by removing that support? Or is that about stepping back, saying we're going to take a step back and let what is natural happen, let God's will, as is shown in nature, take its course, to go on its way? So it's a very, very complicated situation. There's never a yes, there's never a no. What I always think is you need to be taking key ideas out of the ethical theories, taking key quotes from those ethical thinkers, and be saying, right, so for example, with Aquinas, and natural law is the sharing in the eternal law by rational creatures. The rational creature bit is suggesting to me you're using your reasoning. And I might quote Aristotle that it's right reason in accordance with nature. So you are using your rational aspect of you to come to that conclusion. So it is about the individual making that right decision. But then I might quote the primary precept, you know, the preservation of life is very strong, very strict, that is what we see as God's eternal law, and so that can't be violated. And then looking at situation ethics, seeing as love as that axiomatic Christian impulse, recognizing very clearly that you should be led by love, but then asking, well, what is the most loving thing to do? And of course these questions require that evaluation. So you're going to be saying the strengths of using natural law in this situation, the weaknesses, the strengths of situation ethics, the weaknesses, applying it continuously to that specific context. So I want to see case studies in there. I want to see real life situations. I want to see examples of, you know, euthanasia or of business ethics, applying those key ethical ideas, your quotes, your thinkers, your principles, the examples of it in practice to a real event. And I think that is quite a nice question for them to pop in there, just to get us thinking about how we do apply these abstract ethical theories to real life. So that brings to an end this walking talking mark. We started with natural law, we've just finished with euthanasia, and on the way we've explored Kant, we've explored situation ethics and utilitarianism. I hope it's given you quite a brief overview of the key theories and the key things you'll be putting, especially in relation to your evaluation points. Just getting us thinking about them, really. Hopefully the paper that you sit will be favourable, and the topics that we do want will be on there. I do hope you have a wonderful day. I'm Ben Wardle. You can follow me on Twitter at BenWardleUK. Follow me on Instagram, BenWardle_. Read my writing for the Huffington Post at huffingtonpost.co.uk/Ben-Wardle. Thank you so much for your company. Do have a good day, and very, very best of luck